Berlin, 1941. In the smoke-filled command rooms of the Wehrmacht, maps of Europe stretched across long oak tables. German officers leaned over them, confident and assured. France had fallen, Britain stood isolated, and Hitler's armies were driving deep into the Soviet Union. In these circles of strategy and power, America was hardly mentioned with seriousness. To the German high command, the United States was a nation of consumers, not soldiers. Generals scoffed at the thought of a nation of motorists waging a continental war. Their doctrine valued the decisive blow, armored spearheads, artillery precision, and seasoned troops hardened by years of fighting. Trucks, they believed, belonged to delivery men and farmers, not to the battlefield. One staff officer later recalled the atmosphere in those years. We thought of the Americans as wealthy amateurs, slow, dependent on machines, lacking the instinct of war. This was more than arrogance. It was the product of a European mindset that equated logistics with support rather than strategy. For the Wehrmacht, the glory of battle came from tanks thundering forward, not convoys rolling steadily behind. Nazi propaganda reinforced this view. Pamphlets distributed to the front described the U.S. Army as green and clumsy, reliant on mass rather than skill. In speeches, Goebbels painted America as a land of excess, capable of producing refrigerators and automobiles, but not a disciplined war machine. These messages seeped into German thinking, confirming the belief that even if America entered the war, its soldiers would be ill-prepared, its logistics overburdened. Yet across the Atlantic, a different story was beginning. Franklin D. Roosevelt, in his radio addresses, spoke of the arsenal of democracy. Even before Pearl Harbor, he had promised that American factories would deliver not only planes and tanks, but the wheels that armies needed to move. Behind his words, Detroit's factories were already shifting gears. Automobile plants that had once rolled out shiny sedans now prepared for a different product, olive-drab trucks, designed not for style, but for endurance. The German laughter echoed in their war rooms, but it was a hollow sound, born of confidence untested by what was to come. Unknown to them, millions of American workers, men and women, engineers and riveters, were about to unleash a logistical tide that would change modern warfare. For now, in 1941 and 1942, German arrogance prevailed. They had seen America stumble in World War I, arriving late, unready, and reliant on Allied support. Why should this war be any different? The Reich had divisions hardened by campaigns from Poland to Russia. They could not imagine that convoys of trucks, endless and unbroken, would one day pour across Europe like a steel river. The irony was stark. In dismissing the very tools of modern logistics, the Wehrmacht overlooked the lesson that fuel, food, and ammunition often mattered more than tanks or bayonets. Their generals clung to tradition while their adversary embraced innovation. As 1942 dawned, with the war raging on the Eastern Front and the Wehrmacht still pressing its advantage, the seeds of overconfidence were already sown. In the quiet hum of American factories, machines were coming alive. The first trucks were rolling off assembly lines, painted in dull military green, ready for shipment across oceans. The chapter closes with a cinematic contrast. German officers toasting victories in Berlin, dismissing American potential, while far away in Detroit and Pittsburgh, sparks flew in factories, steel pressed into shape, and engines roared for the first time. The laughter of the generals would not last. Soon, the rumble of convoys would drown it out. The laughter of the German generals carried across maps of conquest, but far from Berlin, in the humming workshops of America, the sound was very different. It was the metallic clang of hammers, the hiss of welding torches, and the steady rhythm of assembly lines that had once built family cars. By 1942, those assembly lines were no longer producing chrome-plated sedans. They were turning out weapons on wheels, trucks, jeeps, and utility vehicles that would become the backbone of Allied armies. Detroit, Cleveland, and Chicago stood at the heart of this transformation. Known before the war as the automotive capital of the world, Detroit now became the arsenal of democracy, a phrase first uttered by President Roosevelt in late 1940. The men and women who worked there understood the weight of those words. Civilian automobile production was halted completely in February 1942, and every ounce of steel, every skilled hand, was diverted to the war effort. The numbers alone told a story of scale that stunned even the planners. By 1945, America had produced nearly 6 million military trucks and over 600,000 jeeps. The iconic GMC CCKW, nicknamed the Deuce and a Half, was the workhorse of the Allied advance, hauling troops, fuel, and ammunition from Normandy's beaches to the Rhine. Alongside it, the Dodge WC series carried everything from infantry squads to anti-aircraft guns. The small, rugged Jeep, light, fast, and seemingly indestructible, became so essential that General Eisenhower later ranked it among the 3 most important tools of victory, alongside the C-47 transport aircraft and the landing craft. Factories that had once boasted polished showrooms now became cavernous halls filled with conveyor belts and roaring presses. Women, who entered the workforce in unprecedented numbers, donned coveralls and bandanas. They riveted steel, welded frames, and worked 12-hour shifts to keep production unbroken. One factory worker later recalled in an interview, "We didn't think about sleep. Every truck we built, we imagined carrying boys overseas. It had to be done." For military planners, these vehicles were more than transport, they were lifelines. Generals understood that victory would not only be won by firepower, but by keeping armies moving. Trucks carried food to the front, evacuated the wounded, and brought ammunition to the guns that thundered day and night. Unlike the Wehrmacht, which relied heavily on horse-drawn wagons for supply, even in 1944, nearly 80 of its transports still used horses. The U.S. military embraced mobility at every level. The road, not the rail, became America's chosen path to victory. The transition had not been simple. Engineers spent long nights refining designs for durability. Trucks had to withstand the mud of Italy, the snow of the Ardennes, and the dust of North Africa. Standardization was key. Interchangeable parts allowed broken-down vehicles to be repaired quickly, sometimes within hours. By 1943, American logistics had mastered a seamless system, ensuring that vehicles, spare parts, and fuel arrived in Europe in lockstep with the men who would need them. Even German officers who once mocked American motor culture later admitted its decisive value. One Wehrmacht commander, captured in 1944, remarked bitterly that the Americans can afford to lose trucks. We cannot afford to lose horses. That simple truth exposed the widening gap between 2 armies, one still tethered to the past, the other propelled by an industrial engine that seemed limitless. As convoys began to cross the Atlantic in growing numbers, Roosevelt's prediction of an arsenal of democracy took on a tangible form. From the snow of Russia to the sands of North Africa, the same vehicles rolled under the flags of allies, carrying supplies provided by America's factories. They were more than machines. They were symbols of an industrial might that Germany had underestimated. By the close of 1943, America had already produced more trucks than Germany would manage during the entire war. Each vehicle represented not just steel and rubber, but a shift in strategy, the understanding that logistics was not support, but the essence of modern warfare. The chapter ends with a cinematic image, endless rows of olive-drab trucks stretching across a shipping yard, engines idling as they waited to be loaded onto Liberty ships. Above them, cranes swung, lifting crates of parts and ammunition. Workers, exhausted but proud, watched their creations disappear over the horizon. Soon, those convoys would roll through the battlefields of Europe, drowning out the laughter of the generals who once dismissed them. Before the roar of engines could echo across Europe, America's trucks first had to survive a far more dangerous battlefield, the cold, dark waters of the Atlantic. Between 1941 and 1943, this ocean was the longest and deadliest front of the war. German U-boats, the so-called wolf packs, prowled in packs beneath the waves, waiting for convoys of merchant ships that carried everything from fuel and ammunition to the trucks that would soon drive across Europe. The lifeline of Liberty and Victory ships steamed eastward, packed with cargo stacked from deck to hold. Each convoy was a slow-moving armada, often stretching for miles, with freighters at the center and destroyers, corvettes, and escort carriers circling like anxious shepherds. The threat was constant. In 1942 alone, U-boats sank more than 1,600 Allied ships, sending thousands of men and millions of tons of supplies to the ocean floor. Survivors remembered the horror vividly. One merchant sailor later described a night when torpedoes slammed into the freighter beside his own. The sea lit up with fire. We could see men in the water, and then another explosion swallowed them. Such scenes were repeated endlessly, reminders that logistics came at a terrible price. The trucks built in Detroit and Chicago were not yet weapons in the field. They were fragile cargo lashed to decks, exposed to bombs, torpedoes, and flames. Crews watched helplessly as ships vanished into fireballs. Yet for every freighter lost, more slipped through. By 1943, Allied shipyards launched Liberty ships faster than U-boats could sink them, sometimes completing a vessel in less than 2 months. Escort carriers brought aircraft into the fight, their Wildcats and Avengers scouring the skies for submarine periscopes. Onboard sonar, radar, and long-range patrols slowly tipped the balance. The hunters became the hunted. German crews who once mocked the convoys now endured relentless depth charge attacks, forced deeper into the abyss. Still, the cost was staggering. More than 30,000 merchant sailors never returned, their graves the gray waters of the Atlantic. Every mile was a gamble, every night crossing a test of nerves. Survivors spoke of constant fear, the creak of the ship in the swell, the sudden whistle of a torpedo, the desperate scramble to lifeboats in freezing seas. Yet despite these sacrifices, the lifeline held. By late 1943, the Battle of the Atlantic turned decisively. Improved escort tactics, code-breaking victories at Bletchley Park, and sheer industrial output overwhelmed the U-boat arm. Convoys began to arrive in Britain and North Africa with greater regularity, carrying tanks, planes, and above all, the trucks that would motorize the Allied advance. In British ports, endless lines of olive-drab vehicles rolled down gangplanks and onto staging grounds. To German commanders, the trucks were still abstractions, invisible behind the U-boat war. But on the ground, Allied soldiers marveled at the scale. Rows of GMC Deuce and a halves, Jeeps, and Dodge transports stretched across fields, waiting for their role in the greatest invasion the world had ever seen. The chapter closes with a cinematic image, convoys steaming east beneath a gray dawn, their wakes stretching across the horizon. Beneath them lay the wrecks of ships and sailors who had paid the ultimate price. Above them, circling fighters scanned the waves, and in their holds, America's arsenal of mobility, thousands upon thousands of trucks, inched closer to Europe. The laughter of the generals in 1941 was already fading, drowned out by the steady rumble of convoys that refused to be stopped. When the United States entered the war in late 1941, its trucks were still untested on the battlefield. That changed in the deserts of North Africa. Here, the unforgiving landscape became the proving ground for America's wheeled arsenal. Railways were few, pipelines scarce, and every advance hinged on the ability to move fuel, ammunition, and rations across sand and stone. At El Alamein in late 1942, British and American forces depended on endless convoys of GMC 2.5-ton trucks, the Deuce and a halves, to keep Montgomery's 8th Army pushing against Rommel's Afrika Korps. These vehicles labored through dust storms and scorching heat, carrying artillery shells and jerrycans of fuel. To German eyes, the trucks seemed crude compared to panzers, but their impact was undeniable. An Axis intelligence report grudgingly noted that Allied units could recover from setbacks with astonishing speed, a resilience made possible by motorized supply. The baptism of fire for American ground forces came at Kasserine Pass in February 1943. U.S. infantry, green and poorly coordinated, suffered a humiliating defeat against seasoned German troops. Yet even in retreat, convoys of trucks allowed battered divisions to withdraw in order and regroup. Within weeks, lessons were absorbed. Field commanders began to recognize that trucks gave them a second chance, the ability to shift reserves, bring in reinforcements, and mount counterattacks faster than the enemy expected. What seemed at first a liability became a backbone of resilience. For soldiers on the ground, the sight was unforgettable. One GI later recalled nights when the desert horizon glowed with the beams of hundreds of headlights, stretching for miles. It looked like a river of light flowing across the sand. We knew that as long as those trucks rolled, we would not be beaten. When the campaign moved north into Sicily in July 1943, the challenge shifted from deserts to mountains. Trucks now clawed their way up twisting coastal roads and narrow passes under enemy fire. Dodge WC utility trucks and jeeps darted ahead, scouting paths, while convoys hauled artillery shells, rations, and fuel to the front. In these conditions, the vehicles became more than transport, they were lifelines. Entire batteries of howitzers could only fire because trucks delivered ammunition through the night. In Italy, the terrain grew harsher still. The winter battles at Monte Cassino in early 1944 demanded near-impossible feats of supply. Rain turned dirt roads into quagmires, yet drivers pressed forward, chains on their tires, headlights dimmed to slits. Many never returned. Shellfire and Luftwaffe raids struck convoys, but replacements rolled in behind them. German officers, once dismissive, now recorded with frustration the Allies' seemingly inexhaustible ability to bring up supplies in all conditions. The trucks carried more than bullets and bread. They moved hospitals, engineers, and mobile workshops. They ferried prisoners rearward and brought replacements forward. They gave the Allied armies a flexibility that the Wehrmacht, reliant on horse-drawn wagons for nearly 3/4 of its supply, could not match. A German officer later admitted, "Where we faltered, the Americans kept coming, their trucks never stopped." By the time the Allies secured Rome in June 1944, the verdict was clear. In desert, mountain, and city alike, wheels had become weapons. The mocked convoys had transformed into the arteries of modern war, pumping strength into every Allied offensive. Soldiers who once doubted their worth now spoke of them with reverence. Trucks might not win battles in a blaze of glory, but without them, no victory was possible. The chapter closes with the image of convoys grinding northward, headlights cutting through the Italian night. The wheels of war were turning faster, and soon they would roll onto the shores of France. In the summer of 1944, after the beaches of Normandy had been secured and Allied armies pushed inland, a new challenge emerged. Victory in France would not depend on tanks or planes alone, but on the ability to keep millions of men supplied as they advanced. With railways shattered by months of Allied bombing, bridges destroyed, and ports still under repair, the burden fell on America's trucks. Out of necessity was born one of the most extraordinary logistical operations of the Second World War, the Red Ball Express. Launched in late August 1944, the system was simple but ingenious. Convoys of GMC deuce and a halves, Dodges, and Jeeps thundered along routes marked by red circular signs, reserved solely for supply traffic. The operation began with 6,000 trucks, and at its height, nearly 12,000 vehicles rumbled across France, carrying more than 400,000 tons of supplies in just 3 months. Their task was urgent: to feed the insatiable needs of Patton's Third Army, which was advancing so quickly that its tanks sometimes ran out of fuel only miles from the front. For the men behind the wheel, the Red Ball Express was grueling. Many drivers were African-American soldiers, relegated by segregation to service roles, but now entrusted with a mission that could decide the pace of the war. They drove through rain and dust, often sleeping only in snatches, their convoys moving day and night in an endless cycle. One driver later recalled, "We lived in those trucks. If the wheels stopped, the war stopped." The dangers were real. German aircraft, though weakened, still strafed roads. Ambushes by retreating units were not uncommon. Accidents took a steady toll. The overloaded trucks, pushed to their limits, sometimes skidded off narrow French roads or burst into flames when fuel cans ignited. Yet the drivers pressed forward, guided by blackout lamps, following the red ball signs that led toward the front. To Allied soldiers waiting for food, fuel, and ammunition, the sound of roaring engines in the distance was a promise that they would fight another day. For Patton, the Red Ball Express was nothing less than a miracle. His armored divisions devoured gasoline at a staggering rate, nearly 350,000 gallons a day. Without the convoys, his rapid thrust across France would have stalled. Patton himself admitted, "My tanks could not have gone forward without those trucks." In effect, the Red Ball drivers extended the reach of American firepower, ensuring that every advance could be supplied with fuel, bullets, and bread. German commanders, who once mocked American dependence on machines, now watched with dismay. Reports to Berlin noted the Allies' astonishing mobility, driven not only by tanks but by the convoys that stretched for miles behind them. Unlike the Wehrmacht, still reliant on horse-drawn carts for much of its supply, the U.S. Army could leap across France with mechanical stamina that no German unit could match. The laughter of 1941 had turned into disbelief in 1944. The Red Ball Express was more than a mechanical feat, it was a human story of endurance. Drivers fought exhaustion, loneliness, and fear, yet they rarely faltered. African-American soldiers, often denied recognition, became the backbone of the operation. They proved that logistics was not just about machines, but about the determination of men who knew the war depended on them. By November 1944, as railroads were slowly restored and the front stabilized, the Red Ball Express was phased out. Its mission complete, it had carried the Allied armies from the hedgerows of Normandy to the very borders of Germany. In just 82 days of operation, it became a legend. The chapter closes with the image of endless convoys rolling eastward, engines roaring like a chorus of steel. In every mile covered and every gallon delivered, the Red Ball Express revealed the true strength of America's war effort, not only in its weapons, but in the relentless power of its supply lines. By the winter of 1944, the tide of war had shifted irrevocably. From the shattered beaches of Normandy to the rolling plains of northern France, American convoys surged forward. What had once been mocked as an amateur's army of motorists was now a steel tide flooding Europe. Trucks, millions of them, carried the war eastward, and with every mile, the Reich grew weaker. Across liberated France and Belgium, the rhythm of engines replaced the silence of ruined railways. Convoys rumbled through shattered towns, headlights cutting through mist, tarpaulins flapping in the wind. They carried fuel to Patton's tanks, ammunition to Eisenhower's armies, and food to soldiers and civilians alike. The Red Ball Express had proven the concept. Now the entire U.S. logistical system drove relentlessly toward Germany. A single division on the move required hundreds of tons of supplies each day, and it was the Deuce and a Halfs, the Dodges, and the Jeeps that made it possible. The Ardennes tested this lifeline. In December 1944, when German forces launched their desperate counterattack in the Battle of the Bulge, the Wehrmacht struck hard at Allied supply lines. Snow-clogged roads and freezing weather threatened to halt convoys, yet the trucks pressed on. Drivers chained tires against the ice, hauling fuel to embattled units at Bastogne and beyond. One gunner later recalled that the sight of trucks arriving with ammunition meant we could hold the line one more day. Without them, the German offensive might have torn deeper into Allied lines. Instead, mobility and supply turned the tide. By March 1945, the Rhine lay ahead. To cross into Germany required not only bold assaults, but the steady delivery of bridges, artillery, and men. Trucks hauled Bailey Bridge components to the riverbanks, ferried infantry across pontoon crossings, and carried refugees fleeing the collapse of the Reich. Every road east seemed filled with convoys, their engines echoing like a drumbeat of inevitability. The scale was staggering. By the war's end, the United States had produced more than 6 million trucks and over 600,000 Jeeps, more vehicles than the Axis powers combined. This vast motor pool transformed the U.S. Army into the most mobile force in history. German officers, once confident that motorized amateurs would falter, now wrote with disbelief of the endless streams of trucks. One diary entry from early 1945 lamented that no matter how many convoys were bombed or shelled, more came, without end, as if America had an inexhaustible road. For the Wehrmacht, still reliant on horse-drawn wagons for nearly half its transport, the contrast was crushing. Speed, flexibility, and the sheer weight of supplies gave the Allies an advantage no tactic could overcome. Encirclements that once seemed impossible were now routine, enabled by convoys that kept pace with advancing divisions. Artillery never lacked shells. Tanks rarely sat idle for want of fuel. In modern war, logistics was no longer a supporting arm. It was the backbone of victory. As spring turned to summer, the convoys rolled into the heart of Germany. Along roads lined with refugees and ruins, trucks delivered the final blows of war. They carried food to liberated concentration camps, fuel for the final battles, and men to occupy what had once been Hitler's empire. The same vehicles that had been dismissed as irrelevant had carried the war from the Channel to the Elbe. The chapter closes with an image of highways choked with American trucks, stretching beyond the horizon. Engines roared, tires hissed on wet asphalt, and the black exhaust of convoys drifted into the sky above a defeated Reich. 6 million vehicles had proven the mockery wrong. What the German generals had once dismissed as weakness became the very weapon that crushed them. In the end, victory in Europe did not belong solely to the tank, the bomber, or the battleship. It belonged, too, to the unglamorous truck, the steel workhorse that carried the war on its axles. The convoys that rumbled across Europe proved a truth military historians often repeat. Amateurs talk tactics, professionals talk logistics. In the crucible of World War II, that lesson was written in dust, oil, and endless miles of rubber on the road. The Red Ball Express had been only the beginning. From the deserts of North Africa to the hedgerows of Normandy, from the frozen forests of the Ardennes to the bridges over the Rhine, it was convoys of American trucks that ensured momentum never faltered. Infantrymen remembered how food and ammunition arrived in the nick of time. Commanders later admitted that without the ceaseless roar of the deuce and a half, their plans would have stalled. The truck was not a weapon in the traditional sense, yet it made every other weapon possible. German arrogance had underestimated this truth. In their doctrine, logistics was auxiliary, an afterthought to maneuver and firepower. The Wehrmacht had invaded the Soviet Union in 1941 with more horses than trucks, clinging to 19th-century supply methods. By 1945, as American convoys thundered across Germany, the contrast could not have been sharper. What had been dismissed as mechanical dependence was revealed as strategic genius. The laughter of German generals in 1941 had been silenced beneath the grinding gears of 6 million vehicles. The legacy of these convoys extended far beyond the battlefield. When the guns fell silent, U.S. trucks did not vanish. Surplus vehicles, GMCs, Dodges, and Jeeps, became the skeleton of Europe's recovery. Farmers plowed fields with war-borne trucks. Postal services delivered mail in vehicles painted in olive drab. Refugees and civilians alike relied on the same machines that had once carried ammunition and fuel. In cities from Paris to Warsaw, the sight of American trucks symbolized not just war, but survival and reconstruction. For the United States, the triumph confirmed the power of embracing its greatest strength, industry. The automobile culture that German officers mocked had been transformed into a weapon of global reach. Roosevelt's call to make America the arsenal of democracy had materialized in the form of convoys that spanned continents. They represented not only mechanical might, but also the labor of millions of workers, women riveting in Detroit, engineers designing more efficient engines, drivers pushing through exhaustion on roads lit only by dimmed headlights. The symbolism was unmistakable. Tanks might have captured headlines, and aircraft dazzled with speed and destruction, but it was the truck that sustained the advance. As one U.S. officer later reflected, "Without our wheels, we would still be on the beaches of Normandy." That sentiment echoed across decades of military history. Even in the Cold War that followed, the lessons of the convoys remained. Armies that ignored logistics did so at their peril. The silent rumble of engines through Europe in 1944 had proved that wars were not won solely by daring offensives or brilliant generals. They were won by the unbroken line of supply, the artery that kept armies alive. The final image is one of quiet power, endless lines of trucks rolling eastward into the night. Their headlights cut through mist and darkness, their engines humming with the weight of a world at war. Each convoy carried not just cargo, but the proof of an idea, that victory belonged to those who could move, feed, and sustain their armies without pause. What German generals had once mocked as a weakness became the very thing that crushed them. The laughter in their smoky command rooms had long faded. In its place remained the rumble of convoys that never stopped, the sound of logistics writing the final chapter of the war.